right? And at the same time, the tribal citizens still need to be engaged so that they have that same faith. Now, I talk about internal pressures because there's that fine balance between the two, external and internal, that I mentioned, in that on one hand, you've got all of these banks and federal courts and external lenses looking at what we do. But what happens if our tribal members get to the point that they think tribal government doesn't care about me? All they're doing is chasing these economic development type things, and they're not paying attention to what the community needs. And so I just disengage myself completely, and I'm not going to vote, and I'm not going to participate in the communities, and I completely disengage myself. Now, why would that, and just those numbers of tribal participation, why might that be a bad thing to external characters outside? If I'm a bank and I look at the tribal government and I say I'm thinking about giving this mortgage on a 20-year note, and then I look and I say, wow, your last tribal election, you had 5% of your available voters actually show up to the polls. Why might that make me nervous?
People don't believe in you.
Okay. People don't believe in the process, people don't believe in the government. What else? What happens when only 5% of the people care enough to bother the political process? Okay. It probably isn't representative of the people. It starts to be representative of the people who think that their voices are heard. And it probably tends to be small voter turnout leads to less close political races, and you get the landslide type situations. Okay? What does that suggest? Suggests that a small number of people have all the power in that community, and that everybody else feels so disengaged that they're not even watching what these people are doing. And if they're not even watching what these people are doing, what might happen with these people? Yeah.
When there's no checks and balances, you're eliminating one of the most important ways of making sure that your government is,
Right.
fair.
You've got no checks and balances, you have no accountability from anybody except for the people who are plugged in, right? And what happens then? The nicest, best people that you've ever known get that kind of power. And what's the power? What is it? The absolute power corrupts? Right. Absolute power corrupts absolutely, right? Because there's no one watching. And it's general human nature to, when you find yourself not accountable to anybody, that's when things can go south in a hurry, even when it's somebody who otherwise has good intentions. And so that type of thing scares the pants off of investors. It scares the pants off of anybody that might try to have economic development opportunities with the community. But it also does something else. If we have a small number of people actually engaged, as opposed to a big percentage of your constituency, what does that say about the tribal government itself to external people? And not the lenders, but Joe Schmo in the county surrounding here, whose public opinion might matter.
Well, if the government's not actually representing the people.
Okay. Lack of representation of people, and what else? What does it mean to be a tribal member to those external forces? Okay. They look at it as entitlement. Okay. That the only thing that you're using the tribal government for is to get benefits. You don't vote, you're not engaged in the process, you don't care what the tribal government really does unless it's impacting you significantly. And what else? People think, whether it's fair or not, and I'm going to say several things that are probably not politically correct, but we're talking about internal tribal government and some of the experiences that I've had too. People look at tribal governments and what do they think? They're less than governments, right? What's that? Right, or your kangaroo court here, less than government. And they think that partially because of the way that our own people think about their government, okay? Now, part of it has to do with colonization, and the power of the federal government got us to this place where everything that we try to do, that regular governments do, we have opposition. And so sometimes tribes just decide, well, I'm not going to try to exercise this jurisdiction. I'm not going to be in court for 10 years over it. I'm not going to try to exercise this jurisdiction. I'm just going to do this smaller thing. But when that happens over and over and over and over again, the mentality of our own tribal members is, I'm a citizen of the United States. I'm a citizen of Michigan, and I'm a citizen of the tribe. And they usually, whether we like it or not, think about it in that hierarchy. Because they're thinking about, I carry a driver's license and a hunting license and a card tag and this from which jurisdictions, and a passport and these types of things. And they seem little, but when you add them all up together, it really gets into the psyche of how our own people think about our tribe's sovereignty, and then that replicates itself as we move forward. Okay, so a lot of pressure. I'm going to go on to a couple of other things, and then we're going to come back to this point. All right, getting into this question about external pressures and whether tribal powers are legitimate powers. Okay, do you have people on the reservation, or have people that are tribal members that would look at some government power that the tribe tries to exercise and think that power is bogus? Okay, what kind of powers? And I'm going to drink coffee while I talk, so I'm going to fill this up. What kind of powers do some of your tribal members think that it would be bogus if the tribe tried to exercise that power?
Well, I hear people complaining about a couple things. The ability to regulate hunting and fishing, probably foremost.
Okay,
And then secondly, the ability to tell them if they're endangering their children.
okay. The endangerment of children and the Indian child welfare thing is huge throughout all of Indian country. Okay, people might not like it, but they don't question whether the state police could come remove a child. And then we have 30 years of federal legislation in the Indian Child Welfare Act that Congress even decided in the late 70s that this was ridiculous, that the states were doing this, and it ought to be the tribe doing it. And so our external constituents get that it ought to be concentrated in the tribe. But across Indian country, what's one of the most feared and hated offices within the tribal government? Indian Child Welfare, because they're going to come take your kids, right? Or the court system, because they're going to make a determination that a parent has acted not in a conformity of the way our community would want a parent to act, okay? What besides Indian Child Welfare? What if the tribal government decided that for purposes of exercising sovereignty, the hunting and fishing is another hot button issue? But what if the tribe decided that, like every other government on the planet, they were going to institute a minute income tax on all money of all employees of the tribal government, Indian or non-Indian? What would happen? Who would be the first people to complain about that? Would it be the other employees that come to work, the non-Indians who come to work in the casino? Not unless they thought they were going to get double taxed. But if their sole income tax was just that the employer was going to withhold it like they would at any other job they've had since they were 16 years old, probably not, because what? They would see, I consciously chose to work for this employer, therefore they're going to tax me, and that's part of the process. Now, when might the non-Indian complain about it? Well, taxes usually go to services. And so if you're taking my income tax and then I'm not getting anything in terms of government services back, maybe so. But what arguably is the tribal government giving in terms of services to those non-Indian employees who work for you? Anything? A job. A job.
Police protection while they're at work.
Police protection while they're here, those kinds of things. Okay. But what would be the objection of the tribal member employee to a 1% tribal income tax? And you have the same reaction every time I mention this in front of tribal, they're like, my government's not going to tax me. And why is that?
And I think because they look at themselves as shareholders and they shouldn't be taxed.
Okay. Looking at them as shareholders, so maybe it's a different way of looking at government, right? Maybe it's like we're all part of this community, so we're bottom dollar, that's going to be in our best interest. Maybe that's part of it. What else? I have a couple of other theories. Maybe the way Indians think about government is different than the way non-Indians think about government. And this is something when I was reading your constitution and your organization chart and whatnot, that you have a very different structure articulated than almost every tribe I've taken a look at so far. Because what? You are the minute handful of tribes that will come forward in your own documents, and I'm going to pass by this internal pressure because we'll come back to this. You're one of the few tribes that in your own constitution and in your own laws, you actually come out and say that you are reserving rights to the people and that this constitution isn't a top-down thing. That your people are at the top, and then they gave powers to the Constitution, and then the Constitution set this government in motion. And that the purpose of this government being in motion is to do some things for the community, but that the people have the power, not the government. And that's very rare. Now that's implicit in the United States Constitution, right? That they had this convention and they all sat down and there were these states that may have derived their power from the people, and then the states gave over some authority to the federal government so that it could function. And so that's how you get federal power over state. But to come out both in the preamble itself, but in the actual sections of your own constitution and say the people are allowing the government to have this power is amazing compared to other tribes, and certainly amazing compared to state and federal governments, because that type of thing at best is a scholarly debate about implicit power. But having that be right there at the beginning of your constitution and then throughout was very telling, I think, about the mentality of how your people think about your government. And so getting back to the situation with the tax, it might not be as easy a leap for your people to say the government's going to tax 1% of my income, because what would be the thought process? I gave them certain powers, and it's spelled out here, and I didn't give them anything beyond those powers. And that could be debated about whether that type of government power was actually given over to the government or not. The other thing that I think is unique about your laws and the way that you define yourselves in the Constitution is that you, at the outset and throughout, talk about this balance between protecting individuality on one hand, but also making sure that you have a strong, unified tribal identity, okay? Very few constitutions say something to the effect that it is something that you're trying to do is to create and maintain this cohesive unit, okay? And I think that having that in the Constitution, and at least in the thought process of the people who put that Constitution to the ballot and voted on it, is very indicative of why your tribal people will respond so well if you do the kinds of things that you're going to talk about in this workshop over the next few days. Because they expect it, at least in their governing document. Now, I talked about these internal pressures that you have and external pressures. And I'm going to go back a couple of slides and we'll come back to your Constitution in a minute. But the internal pressures, pressures about the overall population, disengagement of constituents. Meaning, is there something that the tribal government is doing or not doing that causes people to just kind of throw up their hands and say, I'm not going to be engaged, okay? Now, one of the things, and I looked at your website, and I know that part of the discussion over the next couple of days will be what you might do in terms of notice to the public through technology and electronic means. This is a problem throughout Indian country. It's not a problem unique to you all. But what is unique to you all is that, at least in your governing documents, you say that you don't want this to happen and that you're going to take conscious efforts to have that strength, come back. And a couple of things that I see, again, throughout Indian country, and we've already identified a couple of these this morning, but to some extent, there's this culture of entitlement in Indian country. Not all tribes, but in some situation, a culture of entitlement that where do I get my Indian card? How do I enroll in the tribe, right? And when you get those questions from people, what does that mean? Can my kid get a scholarship, and am I going to get a per capita payment? But usually it's not I care deeply about the tribe and I want to engage as a political citizen within my tribe, so where do I sign up? It's usually this sense of entitlement of, I'm going to engage for these purposes, but not necessarily engage for these other purposes. And so that's something that I think is an internal current that runs throughout Indian country. And the second is some culture of disconnect between sovereign principles. And when I say disconnect between the principles, we talked about the taxation.